Welcome back, everybody. In this chapter, we're going to cover a lot of different doctrines, miscellaneous doctrines, dealing with self, suffering, as well as salvation. So there's lots of different ideas that are kind of tied together in this one chapter. The first thing for us to talk about is the self, and to answer the question, what is the self? And by self, that's what we mean, what makes each person unique, what makes each person an individual. And oftentimes, when we address this question, we think about the body, right? For example, face. That's the picture on your driver's license, right? To prove your identity. It's your face. But that's not the body. But people would say, well, what about a fingerprint, right? Fingerprints are used to unlock electronic devices today. They're used by the police, right? To identify suspects. But that's not the self. And people say, well, my DNA, right? That's what makes me, because twins, right? Identical twins, their DNA is not the same. So DNA, that's what makes me, me. But the answer is no, that's not it either. Then people say, well, maybe an iris scan, right? Because that's one of the latest ways of coming up with identity is an iris scan. And that's not it either. Anything with the body is not the self, okay? And we have to be careful that we don't confuse the self with what we call the empirical self. The empirical self includes all physical aspects, like those we just mentioned earlier, as well as one's conscience, right? Your conscience, that inner voice that guides you in decision making. People say, could that be the self? No, it's not. No are one's beliefs, memories, anything like that. All of those are called the empirical self, part of the empirical self, and are not the true self. So this question of what the self is, then we can see when we go through our day-to-day lives, we're considering what the self is, and that's not right. So what is the self? And the answer is, well, it depends. I know, it depends. So if we look at the Abrahamic faiths, those faiths that spring from Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the self is the soul. So in these religions, what makes you, you is your soul. So a lot of people say, well, why is that? Why is my soul, why is that what makes me, me? Well, all three of these religions teach that human beings, that we are all created in the image of God. And this gives us the Latin term, imago Dei, which is image of God. So for these faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the self is the soul. We're created in the image of God. And it's important to kind of take a little time out right now and think about what that means to be created in the image of God. I have lots of different images in my office, such as those pictures behind me. I also have pictures of our daughters, right? Lots of different pictures here. And that would be an example of an image. If we think about this, we stop and think, what does a picture do? It takes a person, right, and fixes that person. It also eliminates a couple dimensions of that person. When you're with somebody, as opposed to right now, of course, this is an image here, but when you're physically with someone, that person has height, width, and depth, right? three dimensions. So we think that we live in a three-dimensional world, but we don't. There's also the dimension of time, the space-time continuum. This is where it gets really interesting in religion. So we're not three-dimensional creatures, we're four-dimensional creatures. But when you have an image of someone, a picture of someone, right, that's put now into two dimensions, right? Because pictures don't have depth. And a good way to think about depth is you can go to a clothing store and put on clothing, and then they have not just a single mirror, but they'll have a little room that you walk into, and then there's mirrors all around, and you get to see what you look like from the back and at the side, and then you look at yourself and you go, holy cow, I'm really huge. At least that's what I think. That's why I don't go in those little mirrored rooms. So that's what we need to think about with image of God. So when God created us, right? When we think about God, God doesn't just have four dimensions. There's more dimensions to God that we are not aware of. And that's just a really, you can just stop, sit down and think about that. Just like when you look at a picture, no, that picture doesn't have time, right? It doesn't have depth. It just has height and width. So when we were created by God, we're in the image of God. We are not God-like in any sense of the word. We're an image of God. We have lost dimensions that are associated with the deity when we are created. So again, for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the self is the soul because we're created in the image of God. And then the next lecture will turn towards the Eastern faiths to answer this question, and it's going to be different.